Right. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming along tonight to hear Charles Waldegrave address the question of addressing the systemic housing crisis. Charles spoke at a fundraising movie we had earlier this year, and so impressed those present that everybody said we should ask him to come and give us a proper presentation. So thank you very much, Charles. For those who don't know Charles, he's coordinator of the Family Centre Social Policy Research Unit and also works as Co-Vicar at St Peter's on Willis Street. He led the housing workstream as a member of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group and leads the team that sets New Zealand's living wage annually. He also co-led the New Zealand Poverty Measurement Project, which developed 7 of the 10 measures of poverty in the PM's Child Poverty Reduction Act 2018. They include housing costs. Charles has been a massive resource in terms of New Zealand's fight against poverty over many, many years. So welcome, Charles. We look forward very much to hearing you help us on the systemic housing crisis. Please welcome Charles.
Ki te atua. Is this working? Yeah. Ki te atua mō nā manakitanga, me nā āwhina ki a mātou, nā rangatira mā, a tēnā koutou, mihi nui ki a koutou, tēnā koutou, ki ora koutou katoa. Thank you, Mike, for the introduction. Am I speaking loud enough? Is this okay? Just, yeah, if it stops working, let me know. Just a couple of practical things. I've got to turn around to check that my notes and the slides are in the same place. And Andre wanted me to keep the right-hand side, because apparently they put a picture there. So some of these slides are a bit skew-whiff because I had to change all that at the last minute. But anyway, you'll see as we go along. So this is a story of housing. I'm going to deal with a lot of history. I think the housing crisis is not understood well. It's not understood by either party in government, I don't think, very well at all. And it requires a shift of understanding and obviously a shift of investment for it to work. So I just want to work slowly through our history, starting with, okay. Andre, what do I do to get the slides to move? I'm pressing the arrow. I'm pressed all 3 buttons. Okay.
Yes.
Can you move it on? It's not moving with anything I'm doing. Are you able to move them manually? Ah, good. Okay.
I think it might be best if...
Yeah, I'll just see if it goes to the next one. No, it's not. I'll have to get you to move it each time. There's a lot of slides.
You tell him to move.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. You move the stride when Charles tells you, Andre, okay?
Yeah. Right. So this is the first state house. In 1939, I think it was, 12 Fife Lane in Miramar. And many of you, I'm sure, visited that. Next slide. And this is the plaque that's outside that house. And the famous picture, which many people have in their living rooms, is the next slide, which is Michael Joseph Savage carrying in the furniture. I think it was a couch for the first state house. So this was, although there had been early estate houses at the turn of the century, this was the first really large investment by the state in housing in New Zealand. Could we have the next slide, please? Okay, so that investment continued for many years. You can see right through to 2000. And it was contributed to by national and Labour governments. So you get Peter Fraser's government, the Holland government, the Holyoake government, and the various National Party and Labour governments. And you can see the climb of state houses. Now, these were houses for life. That was what Michael Joseph Savage promised, and that promise was held up until 2013. This makes a big difference that people don't have it for life anymore. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? Now, what a lot of people are not aware of is just the extent of investment there was by the state in home ownership. And it's this investment that stopped round about the 1990s, the late 1980s, as soon as we started playing around with this neoliberal experiment. And this is crucial to the argument I want to put forward. So, as you can see, housing loans were made available to servicemen after they came back from the Second World War. This is the State Advances Corporation. Many of you will remember this. And in 1958, civilians on small incomes were granted these 3% loans through either state advances or through the Maori affairs. Then what happened was that those 3% loans were given at a time when the rate for state advances was actually 4.5%, and the private institutions were lending at 5.5%. So this was quite a huge investment of the state. I'll show you to what extent in a second. So couples were able to also capitalise the family benefit. So what you had was a sort of seamless situation where many low-income people could get into home ownership because you could capitalise the family benefit as you deposit and then have an affordable loan for the rest. Okay? Now, next slide, please. Now, what may surprise you is that from 1960 to 1986, so well into the term of the initial term of the Longy-Douglas government, the New Zealand government spent, on average, using 2017 dollars, $1.5 billion per annum. Some years it went nearly as high as $3 billion. 1.5 billion per annum on home ownership products. This was where the whole notion was that New Zealand was a home-owning democracy. And it made a huge difference to people's access into housing. And just so you can be aware of the way superannuation was structured on the basis that people could own their own homes, so by the time they were old, by the time they got to 65, most of them would have paid off their homes, and so superannuation was set for lower housing costs. And of course, that's completely changed now with so many older people reliant on the private rental market. Now, the other part of the story is the blue line. The blue line refers to lower quartile value houses. And I want to take you through that. Next slide, please. During the 1960s, more than 35% of the new builds were in what they call the lower quartile value. That is, people in the bottom 25% of household incomes could afford them. That's the lower quartile value. By 2003, so this is these big change, housing is really marked by what happened from just before 1990 onwards. By 2003, only 8% of the new builds were in the lower quartile value, whereas more than 40% were in the upper quartile value, and the rest were in the two quartiles in between. At the same time, average section prices have increased from 28% of the total in terms of a house to 62% of the total. Lower quartile value sections increased from 19% to 49%. So you can see that in this next slide. So in this slide, if you look at the lower quartile, that's the purple line. It comes up purple. The purple line, you see how they reduced, because you see it's much better for builders to build for the upper quartiles, because they get, 2 bathrooms, 4 bedrooms, all the, bells and whistles, and so they make much more money off it. And unless it's regulated in some way, as it used to be through the Town and Country Planning Act, if it's just left to the market, then what you get is this huge decline in that purple line and a huge increase in the red line, which is the upper quartile build. Now, this is a big part of the story, because we're not building lower quartile homes at all these days, or very few of them. So if you remember those, the older people here, remember 2 3-bedroom homes, 1 toilet, 1 little kitchen, but we all lived okay. And those homes are not available now. Okay, next slide, please. So this shows you some of the movement. Now, if you just keep looking to those neoliberal reforms, see the way you get this massive increase in both section and house prices once you get past December 86. So the fourth one along, December 1996, you see this increase, and it's just been exponential ever since. Next slide, please. So, the low-cost construction on low-cost sections provided affordable houses for households in both middle and low-income brackets for many decades. But that has not happened since 1991. For median income households, so median's the middle one. If you take all the households in New Zealand, at 50% is the median. So it's different from the average. So the median income households, the house price to household income, remain consistently affordable at 2.8 to 3.7. So what's considered affordable throughout most of the world is that 3 times your income is what you should pay for a house over your working life in order to own it at the end, 3 times. You'll see how massively we are above that later on when I show you other figures. But from 1991, the new build cost price rose from 4.2 to 7.4. So this is more than double what is considered affordable, and I'll show you international comparisons shortly. For low-income households, at 80% of median household income, low-cost houses on low-cost sections were affordable at round about 3.5 to 4.1 of household income. So that was quite a stretch for them. But from 1991, that ratio increased for low-cost construction on low-quartile sections from 5.3 to 9.3 in 2013. This is just massive. This does not happen in most places in the world, as I'll show you. And in 2013, the right to a state house for life was revoked. So with Michael Joseph Savage, everyone had the right to the house for life. I don't know that it had been actually all that well thought out, because you got the house, but then, of course, the next generation was often in the house. And so it wasn't quite clear where it ended. But anyway, that policy stopped. And what's significant about that stop is that older people now, once their kids have gone, and they might be reasonably comfortable, are being pushed out of state houses because they're not considered to be in sufficient need. And so, a sole parent with 3 kids or some household that really is in need gets put in, and these people are put out. They've paid the equivalent of a mortgage over 40 years, and they have nothing to show for it, no asset. They've been asset stripped, I'm going to argue. That's debatable, but that's the way I believe it is. They've been asset stripped, and they're put onto the private market, some of these people. And we're seeing older people, men and women, homeless. in New Zealand, but they're all coming back now. So we've got some very serious problem there. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so I want to look. So here's the way I want to put this talk. This is the housing spectrum, and we have this pragmatic Kiwi way of trying to respond to these problems, and it's not well thought out, and it's not going to solve the problem the way most policy is going at the moment. So we've got real problems at the emergency end and transition housing. And we hate to see people on the streets homeless, so we're putting lots of resources into that. But in actual fact, the reason they're in that problem is because of the problem at the other end. And that is that there's been a massive drop in home ownership. And when there's a drop in home ownership, that puts pressure down on the rental sector. And because there's high demand, those rents go up. That put pressure down into subsidised rental market, onto transition and so on. So that if we want to address this problem, of course we have to meet the immediate needs of those in need of emergency housing. But the critical place that we should be putting a lot of investment is at the top end, back in home ownership, as I'll argue. Okay, can we have the next slide, please? So here was the nasty 1991 year. You might remember the mother of all budgets, if you're old enough. So the national government introduced, this was under Ruth Richardson, the most radical reforms in the history of state housing, the removal of income-related rents. So they used to be, in those days, 25% of income, as they are now, as long as you were under a certain reasonable threshold. So rents in the cities rose on average from 25% to around 40%, according to the research that we were doing at that time. And at the same time, beneficiary incomes were cut so severely that with changes between 1990 and 1993 for welfare-reliant households fell from 72% of national income to 58% in just 3 years. This was a massive double whammy, where the benefit was cut and they moved to market rents on state houses. Now, they, of course, had the accommodation supplement for people renting in the private market, but on average, our research showed that people in the New Zealand cities were paying, on average, around 40% of their income on housing. The family benefit was abolished, so there was no longer any chance of using that to capitalise things. And it took a huge movement. Many of us were part of the New Zealand Housing Network, which was quite a big movement, so that the Helen Clark government, when they came in, returned back to 25% income-related rents on state houses in 2000, but didn't go any further, didn't address the other parts of the housing continuum. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's have a look at this in relation to the international scene. So the way that we normally compare countries is through what is called the median the median multiplier. So that is median house price divided by median household income. It's quite simple. So median multiple, which is affordable, as I said, is 3 times. So if the median house price in a country, when divided by the median household income, comes to about 3, that's considered affordable. If it goes up to 4, it's considered moderately unaffordable. If it goes up to 5, it's seriously unaffordable. And if it goes above that, it's severely unaffordable. Now, for those of you that saw that film Rosie, it was a really amazing film of what is going on in Dublin at the moment in housing. their median multiple was 4.7. So it was in the seriously unaffordable. Well, at the same time as in that movie, you saw the agony that that family went through, and that was a sort of a standard middle-class white family, so it would have been much worse for a lot of others. At the same time as Dublin was 4.7, Auckland was 8.6, Wellington is 6.8, and Christchurch is 5.6. These are the 2020 Demographia International Affordability Ratings. Could I have the next slide, please? And if you want to see how bad it is in New Zealand, here are some of the countries that have the most difficulties with housing, or the highest prices. Australia's 6.9, Canada 4.4, Hong Kong, this is pre-COVID, of course, this would have all changed in the last few months, sad to say. Ireland was 4.7, the same as Dublin. New Zealand, 8.6. Singapore, 4.6, and you can see the rest. The median markets of Australia, New Zealand, and Hong Kong's out of it now, were the only ones that were severely unaffordable. And New Zealand now tops the list, because I'm assuming Hong Kong prices have gone down markedly. Next slide, please. Okay, so this looks at nominal Auckland and Wellington new low-cost dwelling. So the blue line that's not dotted, the straight blue line, refers to Auckland sections, and the dotted blue line is lower quartile value Auckland sections. The red line, straight line, is Wellington sections overall, the average, and the dotted line is the lower quartile value. And you can see the way the costs have just rocketed up over the period, and the big change is in that 86-90 period. Okay, next slide, please. Now, I just put this slide on here because we have this really childish thing that goes on in New Zealand housing. Normally, housing ministers are pretty low down the pecking order. At the moment, that's not true, because Megan Woods is quite high up, but she's got a lot of other quite serious portfolios she's managing as well. But generally speaking, the housing minister is normally quite low down on the list. And what tends to happen is that Labor builds state houses and then National sells them off. And then Labor builds them and National sells them off. And the key government claimed they didn't do that. They talked about the numbers they built. Well, if you look at the actual figures, what you can see is they did have new builds, 2,670. But in actual fact, they sold off 2,728. So they just about sold off as many as they built. And of course, that money doesn't go into housing. It just goes into the general fund. And they use that to show that they're managing the economy so much better. And it's at the price of poor people. And we had this through successive national governments and Labor governments. Now, they have made a commitment this time. Nicola Willis, in fact, from here, promised that that will not happen again. She's the new opposition housing spokesperson. But that certainly has been the history. Next slide, please. Now, I want to show you just how vicious this is to Maori and Pacific families. Now, if you think of it, inequality is not just about income. It's about wealth as well. And the only way you get wealth or assets if you're poor is through housing. It's true anywhere in the capitalist world. It's the only way you're sort of forced to pay for housing, and so the only way that you can build an asset is through housing if you've got access to some sort of ownership. So this is just a graph. I'll give you the exact figures shortly. But what it tries to do is show the movement from 2001 to 2013. And if you just look at the Maori and Pacific sides on the, your right, the right-hand columns, that starting from a much lower base than the European Pākehā group, they had a steeper fall. So could I just have the next slide? Sorry? Oh, that's Middle Eastern, Latin American, and Asian. It's a standard thing, Statistics New Zealand does. Okay, next slide, thank you. So let's just deal with it generally, and I'll come into the specific cultural data. So the proportion, if you take home ownership and renting, the proportion of all people in households living in an owner-occupied dwelling fell from 75.2% to 63.7% between 1986 and 2013, a decline of 15%. Now, why we keep mentioning 2013 is that the last census, 2018, we got no reliable data. It's appalling. So we have to keep referring to 2013 statistics to get census data, which is more reliable. Conversely, the proportion of the population living in dwellings that were not owned increased from around 1/4 to over 1/3 of the population, which was a 46% increase. The proportion of children aged 15 years living in dwellings that were not owned increased even more between 1986 and 2013. From 26% of children, it moved up to 43%, a 65% increase, because Maori and Pacific households have larger families. So, next slide, please. Okay, so what you can see here is the proportion of people in households that did not own their own dwelling. So there you see the top line there is Pacific people. They went from 49 to 67% not owning their own dwellings. Maori, 46% to 57%, and so on. Could I have the next slide, please? So this, I believe, is asset stripping, and I think this is the most appalling statistic. And because of Labour's bent to always think that the way to solve this problem is state houses, I think people really need to understand what's going on here, because I think this is asset stripping of tangata whenua and Pacific people. It's not deliberate, but once we understand it, we should stop it. Changes in home ownership patterns from 1986 to 2013 show for Pacific peoples and Maori the proportion of their populations living in owner-occupied dwellings fell at a much faster rate than the total population. Pacific home ownership fell 34.8%, and Maori of home ownership fell 20%. Now, you think how many people were in houses that they owned and had to default on mortgages for that to happen. In 1986, around half of Pacific and Maori children lived in an owner-occupied dwelling. By 2013, the proportions were 38.5% of Maori children and 28% of Pacific children. So I think while we're doing all these things to try and address these cultural issues in so many other ways, through the treaty and all sorts of other ways, what is actually holding everything back and undermining all that we're doing in this is that people are being asset stripped. And this is wealth inequality. This is absolutely fundamental inequality that should not be happening. Okay, next slide, please. So, this looks at lower quartile rents, wages, and consumer prices. So what you've got in the blue line going through there is the lower quartile rents. So you see how it suddenly gets on top. And what you've got in the green line is the average weekly wage for employees. And the CPI is the red line. So a lot of people aren't aware that the CPI does not measure housing costs. So it actually isn't really helping us understand real inflation. I don't know who did the trick, but someone way back made sure that the CPI did not measure housing costs. So you don't get that coming through. You just get food and all the other ordinary costs, but not housing costs. So you can see how much lower that is. And then you see how wages, the rents start getting much higher than wages. And I'll give you some specific figures about that. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to talk, this is the report in the last budget as the Prime Minister got the Child Poverty Act passed. They have to report on 3 primary measures and 7 other measures of poverty each year, and both sides of the House have agreed to do this. It'd be interesting to see if the national government would do it when they were in power, but anyway, both sides of the House have promised to do it. And this was the first report in the wellbeing budget. Now, these 10 measures we provided through the New Zealand Poverty Measurement Project, so that was myself, Bob Stevens and Paul Frater. Back in the 1990s, we introduced these measures to New Zealand. And it took quite some time before Brian Perry started picking them up in the early 2000s in the Ministry of Social Development household income reports. But they became, actually 25 years after we published our first peer-reviewed paper, they became part of the law that they had to be reported on. And what you can see is that when you compare, so BHC is before housing costs, and AHC is after housing costs. So when you look at the children at 50%, this is the lowest poverty rate. I think actually a truer poverty rate is more like the Europeans use, which is 60% of median household income. But 50% is what OECD uses. So before housing costs, you can see that in 2017 and 18, children, about 16.5% of children were below that baseline, and about 14.9 by 18-19. But after housing costs, it actually begins at 22.8, which is really 23% of children, and that had reduced to 20.8. But if you compare the before and after housing costs, it's quite different. And material hardship is a non-financial measure, of course. Now, next slide, please. You might have seen this in the Dominion today. I just thought it was perfect when I was reading it this morning, thinking I was coming to speak with you. And I want to just talk about the political challenge here. So there's Key in the housing crisis. Everything is firing. Here's Jacinda using a water pistol against these flames. Now, I think housing has an ideological divide, and I think both ideologies are really unhelpful. So for the Nats, their default position is the market will solve this. For Labour is, we'll just build more state houses. They'll control it and they'll build more state houses. Well, everyone that's in a state house does not get an asset. All the rent they pay goes to the state. They reach their retirement age and later on, and they have no asset to show for it. And the state has received very often the equivalent of what middle-class people have paid on a mortgage. Now, I think that's outrageous. And I think more New Zealanders need to begin to think that that is outrageous. And a Labour government should not be promoting that. We need to break out of our understanding, out of these sort of ideologies and default positions, and get a much greater sophistication in terms of addressing housing security and wealth inequality. Now, the commitment that the current government's making to home ownership has turned a corner. Megan Woods announced the $400 million for progressive home ownership. It's a substantial amount, but it's very small for what's needed, and it's taken a long time to get going. You know, the first house is only just coming on now, and it was announced in September 2019. But that's the direction that we need to be thinking about. Next slide, please. So I just want to share 2 slides that we developed in the housing work group of the Welfare Expert Advisory Group. I chaired this group. So The average cost of rent for low-income households is 45% of household income. So that's nearly close to half. So that's why there's so much poverty. That's why people can't afford to feed their children properly and to get, sort of basic needs to participate in society. To be fair, the government put in $5 billion when they first came into power in 2017, early 2018. They put in the families package, and that did make a difference. And you could see in those reports some of the poverty had come down. But it is so far behind. In fact, it's never really fundamentally changed from what Ruth Richardson did, that the structure of the benefits has not fundamentally changed. House price inflation has been double that of incomes during the last 5 years. That was up until 2018. I dare say it's much higher now. So you've got the price of houses double what the movement in incomes. So it's inevitable you're going to have a train crash. Vulnerable people need affordable and secure homes. So these are our recommendations in the WEAG report. Government needs to increase the variety of home ownership options, including equity sharing, rent-to-buy in state houses, papakāinga housing, and other affordable home ownership products for people on low and middle incomes. The accommodation supplement is the largest single benefit cost apart from superannuation, and it's growing exponentially. It's not solving the problem, but it's becoming a huge cost to government. So when you add the accommodation supplement, income-related rents, and the transitional transitional assistance, is it transitional? TAS, something assistance supplement, which is largely for housing, 2.7 billion is paid each year, which is about 3.1 of total Crown baseline expenditure. Can we have the next slide, please? Oh, yeah, just put them all down, yeah. So what we're arguing for is to facilitate innovative thinking and action to increase home ownership through rent-to-buy schemes, shared equity schemes, low-interest loans, or fixed mortgages, microfinancing, and similar, including state houses. That people can purchase their own state houses as long as those houses are replaced, of course. Now, Labor's often been really against the selling off of state houses because the Nats would sell them off and not replace them. But if you look at that period from the Second World War right through to 1986, they sold off state houses with a 5% deposit, which you could get with the family benefit, with 3% loans, and they increased the building of state houses at the same time. So it's perfectly possible to do. And once you have an equity, even if it's 10% in a house, you're in a totally different position to when you're renting. You can put up pictures. You've got a much better negotiating position to add on a room if you want to. You can do all sorts of things you can't do when you're renting. Landlords stop people putting up pictures sometimes. Don't let you have pets. Don't let you, you're not free so often. When you've got some form of equity, you can't be moved. And some research we did for TPK in the hotspots in around about 2010, 2011, when the national government was trying to sell off all the state houses in Grey Lynn, Pomari here, and in Napier, was it Marae Nui? I think it was, yeah. And there were all these protests. We were asked by TPK to interview many of their families that were affected, and their children just went from school to school. They were just pushed out of houses. They go to another school. A landlord then moves them on, because they only needed 3 months in those days to move them on, and it just goes on and on like that. So the government needs to increase the capacity also of the third sector. So this is the second innovative piece that I don't think the government gets. They like to control things. And even with progressive home ownership, they're not building a third sector. Now, a third sector in housing is like the UK housing associations and a lot of the council housing in the UK. It's a very large proportion of the housing stock there. And the government, instead of having their own state houses, they invest in all these community-based, not-for-profit organisations, many of whom are bigger than the New Zealand Housing Corporation, and run massive businesses, and invest in the people, support them through when they have mortgage difficulties and stuff, support them through those, and plough all the profits back into housing. At the moment, the state relies on private developers, and a lot of the advice they're getting is from private developers, and it's very much in the interest of private developers, which is why KiwiBuild was such a subsidy for so many private developers. Now, what we need to do is build up that capacity of the third sector, and we have them, these CHIPS groups, community housing providers. The New Zealand Housing Foundation has done 2 or 3 developments of 200 houses each, one in Christchurch, 2 in Auckland, and they are capable of building 1,000 now. They pass to these people, they provide rent and home ownership options, and they support people when they get into difficulty. If they become unemployed, they help with mortgage holidays and arranging things for them. That sort of organisation needs to be encouraged. There's also Cha Community Housing Aotearoa. It's a really important group in terms of facilitating many of these initiatives. And it's this combination of home ownership and building a third sector, I think, is absolutely critical to the future of housing. And obviously we need to develop and enact laws around healthy housing and so on. Now I just want to finish with just a couple of slides, or a few slides on home ownership. Yeah. So this is a study we did on literature on home ownership. And we drew together more than 120 international studies. And by far the majority, under each of the 6 categories, health, employment, crime, welfare, wealth and education, demonstrated statistically significant positive effects of home ownership. Now you might think, well, that's because wealthier people or more educated people are in home ownership. Well, many of these studies actually controlled for those factors. Even when you control for those factors, you get some of these results. Next slide. So a summary of this was that by far the majority of studies under each of the 6 categories, health, employment, crime, welfare, wealth and education, demonstrated statistically significant positive effects of home ownership. And this was after controlling, many of these studies controlled for these critical aspects of socioeconomic status, income levels and so on. Next slide, please. Just to give you an example, home ownership was found to be significantly associated with lower rates of coronary heart disease, lower rates of long-standing illness, self-reported health, lower consultation rates with general practitioners, lower rates of teeth loss, and it just goes on. And there's just a heap of studies. Could I have the next one? You see, as an example in education, I'm only just putting these up just to show you. Green and White found children in homeowners stay at school longer than children of renters after controlling for income and length of tenure. After controlling for parental income, education, family mobility and neighbourhood characteristics, Boehm and Schlottmann found children of homeowners to be significantly more likely to achieve higher level education. These are just some of countless numbers of studies. And next slide, please. This was a study we did with Kay Saville-Smith. This is for the National Science Challenge on building better homes, towns and cities. And our role in the particular study was to look at 3 generations of groups that experienced housing security post-war, so in the 50s and 60s, and follow 2 generations after that. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but the yellow shows it helped a lot. So when they were interviewed, and these were in-depth interviews, when it came, just to summarize the findings, their social status and cultural security, being near a family, those yellow lines said those things really helped them a lot through all of those aspects. Next slide. Generation 1, this talks about how it gave them a step on the ladder to buying and living their own dream home, a home for you and your family to live more comfortably and so on. And what was interesting was when it came to the ones down the bottom, something you could sell quite quickly and make some money on, they didn't have any affirmation or very little affirmation of that at all. Something you could sell at a later date and help pay for your retirement. They weren't interested in that. It was a home that they could live in. And the next slide. And this is generation 2. You can see they were even happier. These were groups that were brought up in these secure homes and then went on to live in more secure homes themselves. Now the final slide, because I've gone on far too long. I just want to try and sum it all up. This is looking at this housing continuum. We've got to start getting really intelligent about this subject, and I don't think the policy is intelligent at the moment, and it needs a lot of pressure with government, and a society like this could be very helpful in doing that. There needs to be a paradigm change. If we want to help emergency housing, transition housing, and subsidised rental housing, then we have to hit home ownership and subsidised ownership and market rentals. You've got to hit the other end in order to help this end. They all need to be done, in fact, at the same time. The home ownership options addresses both housing security and wealth inequality. And if we don't address home ownership, we are actually saying that we don't want basically 40 to 50% of the population to have any form of asset capability, because if they don't get it through housing, most of them are not going to get it at all. So I think our view of inequality has been just completely skewed into income inequality. I mean, that's bad enough anyway. But it makes such a difference if we can think of home ownership as a home where people have some control over their lives, as opposed to a housing product, which it's become since the 1990s. And we have to build the capacity of the not-for-profit third sector. It will serve us much better. It's committed to communities. It ploughs all its profits back into housing. And contrary to the way a lot of developers and so-called financial experts speak, they are actually really capable. They know this area, and they can develop a lot, and we should have faith in them. And what I would say to the Labour government is, this is the stuff of legacy. What's the point in putting up benefits if it's just going to go straight to landlords' pockets, which is exactly what's happening at the moment? Of course we've got to put up the benefits. I was part of the WEAG report, totally committed to that. But most of it's going to go to landlords if we don't start picking up some of these options. And the other part of the legacy is, if this government doesn't do it, I reckon it will be out at the next election. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Charles. Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Charles. No, working? No. Thanks. I'm being very effusive. Yeah, you are. Just like you. Very effusive. Thank you 3 times. But, are you going to give it to me? No. There you go. Okay. Right. Well, there's a challenge. Well, I will say, you've taken on some big ones, Charles, in the past, and made a huge, amount of progress and difference, as I've said before. So this is a biggie, and good on you for raising it, and good on you for posing it in that direction. So, now, enough from me. Who would like to ask some questions or pose some,
And is there someone who can move this microphone around as well? Do we have a runner?
Hey there, Charles. So earlier in the talk, you talked about the kind of the incentives behind the national government in the past.
Can you just put it closer to your mouth?
Yeah. Oh, hey everybody. Earlier in the talk, you talked about the incentives for the national government to sell off state housing to bolster the view that they are managing the economy well, managing the government well. But then you mentioned on the other side of it that the labor governments were often building state housing that the national would just sell off. So what then is the incentive for the labor government to take the strategy of building state housing as opposed to something like you propose here?
Just give me the last part of that question again. What's the incentive for the Labor government to what?
So it seems like you mentioned that the Labor government goes about things by building state housing, and then the national government sells it off, but they're like, okay, well, we're going to build state housing. Why do that? Why not do something? Why are they doing that now as opposed to something like you're proposing here?
Well, to be fair to the Labor government, they have got a massive state housing program going on at the moment, and that is important. But there's always been so much pressure on Labor to restore state houses because the Nats have always sold them off. So it's a sort of it's a totally silly thing that goes on. I hope that the way Nicola Willis has put it, that the Nats have stopped that and won't continue to do that. What now I think is the challenge is can Labor do what it used to do and what National used to do, in fact what both parties agreed to do, and that is when people get into a state house and then establish themselves, that they can start having an opportunity to own part of that, start sharing the equity in that house a bit. Now, that's no good if you don't replace that house. You've got to continue a building program to replace that because there's going to be more people in emergency situations that need to rent initially. But that's the way people can get out. And then once they have an equity of, 5 or 10%, they can sell that house, and that gives them enough of a deposit to get into the private market or to go somewhere else where they might be interested in doing. People get control of their lives, and nobody can tell them what to do on their own property once they've got some part of equity in it. So that's what I think is crucial to it. Yeah. And that should appeal to National Party too, in a sense, because it is getting people actually off welfare and onto their own feet. It should appeal to both sides of the house. Yeah. Yes. Oh. Hold it. We better
wait for the microphone. If I can come past.
I'm actually wondering whether it's time for us to actually sort of change the idea like we must own a property, because I do understand, even I don't have I don't have the numbers to support it, but I heard in a lot of countries in Europe, say Scandinavian country or Germany, a lot of people don't really own the property. They sort of rent, but then because they have a very stable say rent control and the rent is reasonable, and I think New Zealand could really look at this, because there are some things about owning a property not really that attractive to some young people either. But I'm saying just how we can control, like if you have rent control and make sure the rent is reasonable, then there is no incentive for people who want to speculate and to buy the property and invest a whole lot of it, and then, even without capital gain tax, as long as people don't really speculate, too many people are buying more than one.
Let's deal with that. The European situation is often brought up. So in many of especially the central and northern countries of Europe, there's not a huge push for home ownership, and there doesn't need to be for some reasons I'll give you. It's a totally different housing market there. First of all, they have absolutely strict rent laws. So if you're a landlord, you can only put rents up at a certain amount, and you cannot remove anyone from your house unless one of three conditions occurs. They trash the house, they don't pay the rent, or the landowner themselves, only the landowner themselves, wants to move into that house. Now that's true of Holland, Germany, many of those European countries have laws like that. Now we cannot I mean, I used to think that that was a good way to solve it. But you can't get that in New Zealand because there is so much middle-class investment in housing for retirement later on, not to mention all those that are farming houses, basically, you know, by buying lots of them and trying to make money that way. Australia and New Zealand set out post-war as home-owning democracies. And you can see just the way the Prime Minister's refused to bring a capital gains tax in. It's unbelievable she's done this, but anyway, she's done brilliantly in so many other areas, but this is a very, very strange decision. But it just shows you how deeply embedded these things are in New Zealand society. We will never get laws like that, I don't believe. Many of us worked for them for decades. And so, given that, the only way to get some sort of stability is through some sort of equity, which gives you control and mana motahaki in your own property, in your own house, you know, your own independence.
I'll come to you in a minute, okay?
Use this one, right?
If I was the Prime Minister and the Minister of Housing, and I really liked your idea and thought, yes, let's do it, what would I have to do specifically to bring it into being?
Why? I think, first of all, there's no fast solution to the housing crisis. You can see how bad it is. It's one of the worst in the world, one of the very worst in the world. So we're talking about a decade of investment. But this is the time to do that, because the whole COVID thing has thrown everything into the way in which we address systemic problems has been turned on its head, really, by COVID. And just as an aside, those people that had a little bit of equity over COVID were able to get mortgage holidays, make arrangements, all sorts of things with banks, whereas all those paying rent had to continue those rent payments even as they were losing jobs or getting much lower income through the government subsidies. They had no flexibility at all, those renters, whereas the people that had some form of equity did have. So what I think has got to happen is there's got to be a massive investment, which we are in actual fact making, in, is it 5 billion or 8 billion in housing? I've forgotten it, the well-being budget. It's a large amount. And it's practically going all into state houses. Now, they've built about 3,000 state houses, this particular government, and that's a big achievement. Now, they need to be doing the same outside of the state, and they need to be facilitating mortgages. And there's all sorts of ways to do it. The accommodation supplement that people are getting could be repurposed in a different way. You can't remove it from people because they just go straight into poverty, but it can be repurposed. And there is no way any government of the future is going to avoid this problem. It is going to be multiple billions of dollars to solve the New Zealand housing problem, whether it's National, Labour, or some other party that comes out. They're going to have to invest it, and this is the time to do it and to address these much broader aspects of it.
Thank you for the talk, Charles. I appreciate it. I'm not in a position personally where I can even consider owning a house, but your talk does raise the question, what can those of us, I'm 64 and I'm living in a council flat, what can we do as individuals that will play a role in moving in the direction that you're talking about? You see, one of the things that's happened for me is a lot of the assumptions in my thinking I've had to unlearn because I was wrong. I mean, my mother passed and I got a small amount of money. I went to the city council and I inquired, could I invest that money in the flat that I lived in as part of that process you looked at? And I was very politely told, we don't do that here. Okay, so I then reconsidered investing the money in education to find a better job. Well, I was wrong about that one too. So what I've found recently in the last couple of years is that all the savings that I do have will very likely be exhausted before I reach 65. So the assumption that I would have a nest egg is gone.
Yes.
Next, the major factor in costs for me now at 64 is health. Would you like to know how much I've donated to my dental care in the last 6 months? Nearly half of my savings has gone, and the next half is heading in that direction. I'm wondering, can people like myself help all of us understand our false thinking through our narratives, but by saying, look, I thought this, but actually that happened, and I've tried this, but that doesn't work. Can this narrative sharing eventually lead us to understand the errors in the models that occupy our minds, so that we can move in that direction?
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, I think there needs to be a lot of discussion. I mean, that's the point of a Fabian society, and there needs to be multiple discussions around these things. I think Labour really needs to be, this government, they're being very cautious. My view of the capital gains tax decision was that they're terrified that the Nats will come to an election and lower tax rates and reverse any capital gains tax. And they think that will be so attractive to so many people they'll lose an election. So it's a lack of confidence and a lack of belief in their ability to actually out-argue that thing and to say how important security of housing is for people. So I think we need to be talking to the government about the legacy, the opportunity they have for legacy. And I think we need to be pointing out that their default position of always controlling things themselves, developing the state houses that they control, rather than getting community and grassroots organisations that are now really got capacity to build these houses, to do it within the community. And you have this fantastic example in the UK of how they've developed that over many years, from Victoriana right through, and how much better that works, that model. And to remember that, poor people could actually access a mortgage, and that we need to find ways for that to happen. You mightn't be able to buy the whole house, but if you can get 40% of the house, you end up paying a lot less on your mortgage than you would in your rent in the private sector. So I just think there needs to be a lot more discussion and a deconstruction of these default options that both our political parties offer at the moment.
We've got a question from... Yep. Oh, yes. I've got two questions here, and some of them may be partly answered by now, but one is about, to what extent is the issue with finance, and to what extent with regulation, or what else? And would steps that encourage private investors to direct funds, for example, to the New Zealand Housing Foundation, be useful?
Yeah. Well, yes, and people have done that. Stephen Tindall set up the underfunding for the New Zealand Housing Foundation, and he's been really, really important in enabling this development to occur. And it was a very progressive approach from the business community, namely, through his whole enterprise there, as he's not, I don't think he's in the warehouse anymore, but those red sheds. As a business person, he saw that and facilitated a lot of community operators. So yeah, I mean, that's great if we can get private investment in there as well. I don't think we should be afraid of that at all.
Can I just follow, because there is one other one. Somebody was asking, where will the government find the funds to facilitate ownership for poorer members of the community when they've got so much else to pay for and aren't willing to do all these other taxes?
Well, I just think when people say they've got so much else to pay for, what is more basic to a family and to a child than a home? I don't think anything is more basic. So I think you start off with housing and you begin to build the other things around it. If people don't have secure housing, That's what causes so much stress and so much difficulty for children, including their own brain development and everything else. So I think, unfortunately, we've bought too much of the neoliberal view that housing is a product. It's not. It's a home. And a home is a very different thing from a housing product. And we need to start getting that, into our hearts and into our heads when we're thinking of investment.
Charles, so you've alluded to the multi-armed systemic issues. So maybe just like to comment in terms of some of the multi-armed systemic solutions. And if I can put up a couple of them, one of them being wider iwi ownership of land in terms of owning the land ongoing, and secondly, government owning land on which housing's built, and thirdly, using radical technologies for building to deconstruct housing costs. So take your pick as to what you talk about.
Yes, I think all those are really good examples, because they're all examples of shared equity. They're all examples of shared equity, what you're talking about. And I think there needs to be a huge priority of addressing Maori home ownership and Pacific home ownership, given that it's less than half Pākehā European home ownership, and that it lost so much more over this period, that we have a responsibility to do that. And quite frankly, I just don't think so many of the other attempts, very good and worthy attempts in society to bring about equity and to build, a much more equal society with Maori and Pacific people, it's just completely undermined when you get that level of loss of wealth in those communities. It's far more, actually, than a lot of the iwi settlements that those people are experiencing. Yeah.
All right, we'll take 3 more questions. One from you, question from you, and you. Okay.
Yes. In your talk, you've mentioned that we need change, obviously, and you've said that we need to put pressure on the governments to make that change. It's not an easy thing to take up and to protest about, and many things are much easier to protest about than this. And I'm not quite sure how you actually start on it. Say, if there were a group in this room today, how we got together, are there groups that we can join already established, or or do we take one issue at a time, or how do we go about this attempt to change, or and not only to change but make other people more aware of the situation that exists?
No, it's a really good question. Well, I think there's all sorts of ways to do it. There are really important groups, and this city is CHA, the Community Housing Aotearoa. They're a really important group in terms of addressing these particular issues. I think it's really important to talk to your MPs. The MPs down here have got a significant place. I mean, the Minister of Finance is in this area, or just beside us up the road there. There are, other important MPs that we should be working with around these issues. And I think we need to, whether it's done through letters in the newspaper or through articles, or developing discussion with people who we know who can influence this whole situation. I mean, I think, when we first started out trying to measure poverty in 1995, I mean, we were just laughed at all the time. People said, it was economically unrealistic and all these sorts of things. But you've just got to build more and more and take the hits as people give them to you, and it changes consciousness. New Zealanders do change quite quickly in the political field. So I think getting with any groups of influence, but particularly at this time, I think it's very urgent we get to this government. So working through local Labour Party, Green Party, particular those two because of the nature of the government at the moment, they can really help, and they should be approachable in the electorates. Yeah.
Yes, hello. When I was a kid, most people in New Zealand were proud of living in a socialist country. It was a mixed economy. It wasn't a dictatorship. It was a shared economy.
Yes.
And it was an economy where the government and the individuals all had a role to play. With the Longi government, one of the credos was the government has no right to be in business. And I just wonder whether this should be rethought, because it seems to me that the housing problem rationally is much better addressed if you look at not only at housing, but at the whole way we do our economy, and specifically to do with who owns what. In other words, if we had an economy with, say, more cooperatives, or more cooperative type of ownership, if we had more government ownership, if we had more ownership or part ownership, but by community organizations, surely that would give more clout, if you like, to carry out housing reforms. This is just looking at that angle.
Well, I think, when we had a really good housing policies, as we did right up to about 1986, we actually had the business community doing their thing, community groups were doing their stuff, and governments of both sides looked after people and saw housing as a critical priority. So I don't think we have to move into a sort of a socialist model that would take us completely off course. What's happened is, I think we've got to tilt back in that direction, because the neoliberal experiment was so extreme and has been so unsuccessful that we've got to bring it back to a sort of a much more middle road types of thing, where there is room for enterprise and that type of thing, but that we don't let things like this just get out of hand and have this sort of stupid blind faith in the market, as though somehow the market's going to look after people who don't matter to the people or the captains of industry. There's no way they're going to look after that. It requires leadership. That's why we have governments. So I think there's some important tilting we've got to do back. Yeah.
I've got 3 points. Well, generally I'll go through them quite fast. So the first example of, what affordable rentals compared to home ownership and all that stuff is a friend of mine. It's cheaper to buy, get the 10%, 20% deposit for a $300,000 apartment each week. It is cheaper to pay for the mortgage and interest than to pay rent in Auckland City. So that's just a real world example of, the cost benefits to it. And the second part with regards to the how one would provide equity to, ensure people have houses, and, because the whole cost thing, as well as working with the third, party market and all that, the NGOs and all that, is that I really do think that as time goes on, the business community, specifically the private business community, would be more inclined with working with, these NGOs and governments, because we're noting a change that over time, things with corporate responsibility and, these companies being more open-minded about climate change and their role in it, that it's changing from a model of, I believe it's called shareholder capitalism, our current capitalist system, to a more shareholder where they don't just look after their, the stakeholders in the company who own a percentage, but they take on account us and the, average New Zealander or whatever. So I think over time we'll see a progression towards business also having a stake in providing affordable housing, as well as, ensuring that there's home ownership opportunities in New Zealand. And the final point, which is quite short, is that I think the entire problem and the entire solution is summed up by good old Norman Kirk, where he talked about all New Zealanders want is someone to love, somewhere to live, somewhere to work, and something to hope for.
Yes.
And I think that really articulates the basic instincts of what we want as New Zealanders.
Yes. And Norm Kirk was right slap bang in the middle of that time of great housing security too. Yeah, so thank you for that. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, just a couple of points. Our next presentation here will be, and it fits into some of the things that Charles has been raising, is talk by Colin James and Councillor. Oh, Mike, sorry. Colin James and Councillor Tamitha Paul. The title of the presentation is Beyond Jacinda, and it's a paper that Colin gave to the Wellington Club a month or so ago, looking at what's coming down the pike, which is he thinks is a series of major issues that will need to be faced by that generation beyond X and Y. So I'm really looking forward to it. And Councillor Paul, of course, is a city councillor here, formerly, just recently, head of the Students' Association at Vic. So I'm really looking forward to that, which I think will be a very interesting discussion. And also we're planning next year to have a conference on the experience of the neoliberal experiment in New Zealand, looking at economic management, the document that the Treasury produced to guide our future in 1984, which I found on the photocopier of the Labour Party headquarters on the Monday after the 1984 election, and thought, my God, what are we in for here? And that will include looking at some of the legislative consequences, including things like housing. So look out for that when it comes. I think that also will be very interesting. So once again, thank you very much, Charles, for, as you have done so many times, taking on the big issues and thinking in a new, giving us plenty to think about in a new way. So please give Charles a round of applause.